Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our Policy Lab today on Palestine and the U.S. elections. For far too long, there has been an unquestioned support for Israel by both the Democratic and Republican parties. And so critics have long used the expression progressive except for Palestine to describe the Democratic Party and its support for Israel. However, the current presidential race shows signs of change, as we've been seeing more Democratic candidates having a more critical and progressive perspective that somewhat takes Palestinians into account. And since the topic of Palestine will certainly remain a consistent question throughout the election season, the goal of this policy lab is to assess the stance of leading presidential candidates and the shift in the US policy discourse on Palestine. And so we're very happy to have with us today Zaha Hassan and Halah Ahmad. So Zaha Hassan is a human rights lawyer and a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She previously served as coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for the UN membership in 2012. Halah Ahmad is the current U.S. Policy Fellow of Al-Shabaka. She completed her master's degree in public policy at the University of Cambridge and has conducted strategic policy research for different government agencies and NGOs in Palestine, Greece, and Germany. Her research covers topics related to equitable development, including displacement and segregation. And so I'm going to start with the question of the shift in the discourse on Palestine, Israel in the United States, especially the policy discourse. And here I would like to ask you, Zaha, how do you think has the policy discourse on Palestine shifted over the years? And how are the elections today different from previous elections when it comes to Palestine, Israel?
Thanks, Noor. Hi, Halah. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on Super Tuesday. Anyone who has to vote today, feel free to leave. Your vote is more important than the Shabaka policy conference, or policy lab, which we have recorded, right, Noor?
Yes, it is recorded.
It's recorded, so we don't want to keep anybody. But thank you for being with us today. And as Noor noted, it's very much the case that there is bipartisan support for Israel and U.S. policy and assistance in support of Israel in the United States. And that has a long history that stems from, as far back as sort of the U.S. attempt to prevent Soviet encroachment on the Middle East. U.S. Strong support for Israel began as security cooperation and support to address that threat. And that later on, when the Soviet threat became less pronounced and the end of the Soviet Union, we saw the end of the Soviet Union in the 90s, things shifted in terms of the rationale behind support for Israel and the amounts of security assistance that the U.S. Allocated towards Israel. And the new justification became this idea that, we needed a proxy state in the region to help combat the rise of terrorism and Islamic extremism. And so Israel managed to also tie its conflict with the Palestinians and wrap it up in sort of this terrorism box, along with other threats that the U.S. was facing in order to create this strong alliance between the U.S. and Israel in the Middle East against Islamic terrorism and Islamic extremism. All Palestinian resistance fell under the category of terrorism and extremism. When we saw the election of Barack Obama, things sort of shifted along this policy narrative that U.S. security interest is tied to Israeli security interests. And we saw that most starkly in the opposition that Israel had to the U.S. pursuit of a nuclear deal with Iran. And so you started to see some fissures in this, the policy justification for the amount of U.S. security coordination and assistance to Israel around that time. And obviously, at that time, there was this personality conflict between the President, Barack Obama, with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, particularly over settlements, which Obama took a position on early on in his administration, calling for a freeze in order to launch negotiations. And so that early sort of battle between the U.S. and Israel early on in the Obama administration left a sour taste in the mouths of many Democrats because of the ways in which that relationship devolved, leading to this the skip the speech event, in where the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was to speak was invited to speak before Congress by the Republican Speaker of the House against the Iran nuclear deal. So that was seen as such a disrespectful thing that the Israeli Prime Minister would do, to come on U.S. soil to challenge the U.S. president in Congress. And so you were starting to see some cracks between Democratic Party support for Israel and this understanding that security interests of Israel were completely aligned with the security interests of the U.S. And just to bear in mind, I mean, there is, President Obama was not anti-Israel, nor was he pro-Palestinian during his tenure. And in fact, he is, he supported the Memorandum of Understanding between the U.S. and Israel, which provides Israel $38 billion in security assistance over the course of 10 years. He negotiated that and concluded that during his term. And President Obama was also the president that added a parameter in Israel-Palestine peace talks, which was that Palestinians would have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state and as the homeland of the Jewish people. So Obama was not, not at all unfriendly to Israel. He was quite friendly to Israel, but it was this perception that Netanyahu was disrespectful and unthankful for the amount of U.S. assistance that really irked many Democrats. And you started to see, especially among the Black caucus in Congress and the Progressive caucus, a kind of rethinking of what the strategic value is of U.S. support for Israel, unconditional support for Israel. And so when we get to the election of President Trump, who billed his presidency as one that would have no daylight between U.S. policy and Israel, these fissures became much more they became more widened, and they became much more clear to people, particularly people on the left. Up until, as I said, up until the war on terror and this idea that Israel was, our security interests lie with Israel because of the war on terror, and because Palestinian resistance was equated as part of the problem with terrorism. The new justification for support of Israel became, or not new, but also added justification, was that, especially in light of the ways in which we parted ways on the Iran nuclear deal, the idea was that, our relationship with Israel is important just for the sake of that relationship, because we share the same values, that Israel deserves a sort of special relationship with the U.S. And so when we get to the Trump administration and we start to see President Trump aligning himself with white nationalism, or at least flirting with white nationalism in authoritarian regimes, and similarly in Israel with Benjamin Netanyahu also being very permissive to the anti-Semitism coming from authoritarian regimes and white nationalists, you start to see that the fissure expanding between the left wing of the Democratic Party and the more liberal or the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party. And if the justification for continued support for Israel lies in the shared values between the two countries, that becomes much more problematic under a Trump administration, which is, basically with the release of the Trump plan, not just endorsing, but actually crafting the architecture for apartheid in Israel-Palestine. So what Democrats are now faced with is sort of this dilemma of, how do we maintain support for Israel if our support was based on shared values and the special relationship, in the face of the fact that Israel is on the cusp of annexing at least 30% of the West Bank and will in fact officially become an apartheid regime. So this is the policy discourse and where we're at right now. There should be no mistake. The Democratic Party is still very supportive of Israel, and the security justification for continued support for Israel is still there. But what I'm describing now is the beginning of a rethinking of U.S. policy that's going to have to take place, particularly among Democrats who have more strongly been proponents of a human rights-centered approach in foreign policy and been more supportive of democracies abroad. It's going to become much more hard for those Democrats to articulate a justification for continued support for Israel in the face of what's looming following the Trump plan release.
So thank you, Zaha. So building on that, Halah, you published a commentary with Al-Shabaka today in which you traced the top Democratic presidential candidates' position on Palestine, and you assessed them relative to their stances on racial justice in the U.S. So drawing on that, can you tell us more about the stance of the main presidential candidates on Palestine? And in a way, how has their stance changed over time?
Right, yeah. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Zaha, for that really illuminative history. The one thing I'll add to that as well is that alongside the shift in elected leadership in their conversation around Israel, we see also in the Democratic electorate increasing sympathy with Palestinians, and that has mirrored that trend. So we have recent polls from both Pew and Gallup that say that, among the Democratic electorate, 27% of that electorate, only 27% is more sympathetic with Israel than they are with Palestinians, whereas on the Republican side, that's 79%. So you have a very clear demarcation happening and polarization happening around this issue along partisan lines. So speaking to the issue of the candidates' views themselves, I think it's really important to say first, why is it important? And it's important because in this election, we have two of the most progressive candidates we've seen in a very long time in a U.S. presidential election. And we see it in the context of a larger movement to address racial inequality. And so it really leaves the question, are those same principles that undergird a racial justice agenda extending elsewhere, and how do they reflect on the broader foreign policy agendas of the candidates? And in particular, in this election, Palestine is a real indication of that, and their stances on Palestine. And the second reason I'll just briefly say, which I'm sure most people know, and Zaha reiterated, is that the U.S. gives $3 billion in aid to Israel each year. And when it comes to foreign policy, this is the largest U.S. aid that it gives to any other country. So the Trump administration has really affirmed this stance and moved the needle really far right when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And candidates would be really remiss in this election to ignore that. And I think it's part of why it's come up a lot more in this cycle. So let's start with Warren. So there's been a recent evolution in her rhetoric over this campaign in favor of Palestinian human rights, but her record is really aligned with an establishment stance, and we've yet to see a really firm accountability, a set of measures for accountability for Israel and a centering of Palestinian rights to equality and dignity. Like all of the candidates, and so this is true across the board, she supports a two-state solution. But the other thing that she has been really known for is reiterating some of the same rhetoric that actually comes from the right. So on her record in 2014, when we saw one of the most violent onslaughts on Gaza, which left over 2,000 Palestinians dead, a third of them women and children, Senator Warren had voted actually for a resolution in the Senate to give more aid to Israel in that time, and also to affirm Israel's right to defend itself and the U.S.'s support for its security. So that was a real stance. And at the time when she was asked about the conflict and the Palestinian death toll, her response was really a reiteration of some of Netanyahu's own talking points around Israel's inherent vulnerability and some of the rhetoric around Hamas and the use of dense population centers and things like that. And so we saw a real primacy of Israeli security for her, even in that context, which now is being investigated among other issues in the International Criminal Court for war crimes in 2014 and ongoing war crimes in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. Now, in 2019, last November, when there were 34 Palestinians killed in an assault on Gaza, we saw that Senator Warren was instead saying, she welcomed the ceasefire, and she affirmed Israeli needs for security, but at the same time, she was sort of tiptoeing around naming Israel as complicit in those deaths. And since then, and since November, she has really taken a more significant stance when it comes to a few different issues. So first of all, when it comes to settlements, she's taken a stance against annexation. She's opposed the rampant settlement growth, and she has been opposed to as well some of the stipulations of the Trump plan. And she's really in favor of getting Palestinians to the negotiating table. One of the really big developments in her rhetoric and changes was that she made a statement saying that everything is on the table when it comes to holding Israel accountable, including aid to Israel, accountable to stopping the settlement growth. So that's a real push for accountability, which was first seen by actually Sanders, who was the first to raise that. On the other hand, she has loosely said that she opposes the occupation, and it's notable that this shift is purely rhetorical at this point. We see it in her rhetoric, and it's been a great, from a Palestinian perspective, it's been a development towards a more progressive policy on Palestine. And she then as well also was the first to announce that she would miss the AIPAC conference this year, which we know a host of Democratic candidates, even the ones who've now dropped out, took a stance on because of its real support for right-wing policies in Israel and Palestine. So she has been particularly direct as well in calling out Netanyahu for corruption and for really right-wing policies. But she nonetheless really reaffirms the rhetoric of Israel as a friend and ally, and is prone to prefacing any talk of Palestinian rights with talk of Israeli security and vulnerability in the region. So it's yet to be seen really how firm her new rhetoric on Palestinian rights is in holding Israel accountable, but we have seen some positive movement from her. When it comes to Bernie, Bernie has the longest standing record of critiquing Israel's use of force and injustice against Palestinians, and in fact that's only been increasing. He's had an increase in rhetoric on accountability for Israel as and even as a Jew and as someone who's lived in Israel and actually calls himself pro-Israel. He has been by far the most progressive in his platform and record on Palestine. So I would say that the oldest record that that you can point to for his critique of Israel is actually when he was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and during the first Intifada was one of the few to call out really brutal tactics by the Israeli military at that time. In 24, on the legislative record, in his time in the Senate, he has been someone who tiptoes around the issue. He makes public statements in 2014 to oppose what's happening in Gaza with, like I said, the death of over 2,000 Palestinians. And at the same time, those resolutions passed in the Senate to affirm Israeli security with unanimous consent. So he has no record of actually sticking his neck out in that chamber on those issues, but has a stronger record of critique. And so in this cycle, he was the first to say that he would consider conditioning aid to Israel when it came to the settlements and holding Israel accountable to what are the precursors to good faith negotiations with Palestinians. And he also has been very opposed to the settlement enterprise and what it does to the peace process as well. He like Senator Warren, is a supporter of the two-state solution, but has consistently coupled that with rhetoric and affirmation of Palestinian human rights and dignity, and a need to include a framework for Palestinian self-determination alongside accountability measures for Israel. So I would say, Bernie's record has been the most consistent on Palestine and his values, and he's been the most willing to critique Israel for undermining any context for, good faith negotiations and ensuring Palestinian rights and dignity. On Biden, we have a totally different story. Biden has...
Halah, but very quickly, please.
Oh, sure. Thanks. Yeah, this could go on really forever, so I hope folks will ask questions. Biden has a long history of support for Israel, so he's a self-ascribed Zionist, and even as vice president during the Obama administration, he has a record of really pushing to the right of even Obama's policies with Netanyahu. He spent 12 years as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and during that time had a strong pro-Israel stance throughout when legislation went through. And in fact, while he called any conditions on U.S. aid to Israel really bizarre as a proposal from Senator Sanders, he actually, along with in the Obama administration, repeatedly withheld U.S. aid to the PA, which amounts to just 1/6 of the amount it gives to Israel, to pressure Palestinians to not pursue statehood at the UN or other, pursuing cases with the International Criminal Court against Israel. So, he's really somebody who has said, the settlements are unnecessary, but hasn't really stuck his neck out to hold Israel accountable while affirming this stance of the two-state solution.
Thank you so much, Halah, for this comprehensive account of where 3 different candidates stand on Palestine. And to our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, to submit your questions online, because in 5-7 minutes, we will actually start asking your questions. So Zaha, I'm going to come back, return to you, because one of the main forces behind the shift in public discourse is the role that civil society played in influencing U.S. presidential candidates. Can you tell us more about this briefly?
Okay, I'll try to be really brief. The fact that Israel-Palestine policy is a domestic issue, more so than it is a foreign policy issue, means that civil society has a really important role to play in influencing the public discourse on Palestine. And as Halah has already noted, within the Democratic Party, among Democratic voters, polls show that Democratic voters support human rights for Palestinians, and they also support sanctions against Israel for not complying with those. So the challenge has been how to get this sense among Democratic voters and the public at large, who also generally don't support policies such as denying free speech rights to those who would criticize Israel or who would wish to engage in boycotts, consumer boycotts. So the challenge is how to get more of this discussion within the public discourse, so that it can then graduate up into a change in policy. Up until very recently, the discourse among civil society has been controlled by sort of the and I would call it the pro-Greater Israel lobby, and which folks know as AIPAC, and the evangelical leadership and organizations like Christians United for Israel. Their agenda has been very much one of normalizing settlements and settlers and establishing a history of Jewish connection to the land in the West Bank. It's been about delegitimizing access to legal mechanisms, a multilateral forum. These organizations have been about equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism and delegitimizing any kind of BDS activity. These CSOs, these civil society organizations, they have a strong reception within both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party for their agenda. So, but what we've seen of late, which Halah talked about a bit too, is how civil society actors that have been promoting a progressive understanding of what U.S. foreign policy should look like have been gaining ground. Folks that have been calling for freedom, justice, and equality for Palestinians, they have been gaining ground. And they've been buoyed by what we've seen in terms of, and just in the last few years, what we've seen with the election of progressive members of caucus who are challenging sort of the accepted orthodoxy when it comes to Israel and when it comes to things like BDS and what is and is not anti-Semitism. So they've helped to sort of really get within the public discourse and in terms of all the media coverage that they've had around especially Representative Ilhan Omar and Representative Rashida Tlaib, all the attention that has come with them entering into the House. So that has really helped the public discourse. There's also been a lot of work done in terms of getting members of Congress to visit Palestine and not just Ramallah, but visiting beyond to see what the occupation looks like on the ground. And this has helped to spur a change in the public discourse. Obviously, when we have catastrophic events around Gaza, when we've had the bombardment of Gaza in successive fashion over the course of many years, this has also buoyed the discourse around what U.S. support for Israel means. The problem that we're facing, and obviously now with the release of the Trump plan, in which the U.S. has designed the exact architecture of apartheid and called that a peace plan, this can only help fuel the discussion for a human rights centered approach to U.S. foreign policy, and increase sort of those folks within the Democratic Party beyond the progressives to start to rethink U.S. foreign policy in the region. The question is what are the policy asks? And if you ask any policymaker on Israel-Palestine, they'll say, okay, sure, we can condition aid, we can do X, Y, or Z, but what do you want us to achieve? What do you think we can achieve? So the real challenge for those of us who would like to see a more rational engagement by the U.S. Between Israelis and Palestinians is how to now show that it is still within the U.S. interest to be engaged, but to be engaged in a way that promotes Palestinian rights. And without a political solution on the horizon, many lawmakers and folks in the administration are going to be very leery of even entering into the Israel-Palestine policy debate, because they don't think that they can add any value at this time, because U.S. engagement has been so poor in the last so many years.
Thank you so much, Zaha. This is very important, and maybe when we have the Q&A, we can talk more about what Palestine solidarity groups can do in the future. But for the sake of time, I have to start asking the questions from the audience. And here, Halah, there's a question from Youssef about future trends. And he's saying that it's still very likely that Trump will win the 2020 election. So what should the Palestinian political direction be in that case? And in general, what the Palestinian political, what should Palestinians do if Trump wins the elections and if there is no change?
Well, what I think is important to talk about is not just what Palestinians should do, which I think really should be determined by Palestinians on the ground in Palestine, hopefully with input from Palestinian diaspora folks like myself. But what should be asked as well is what Palestinian solidarity groups or their allies or those advocating for human rights across the board should do to hold the Trump administration more accountable. And one of the things that we need to talk about is really bolstering the work of intersectional solidarity organizing, which has been incredibly effective and essential in educating a larger American electorate about Palestinian, Israeli human rights abuse and Palestinian rights writ large, and really demanding that candidates who stand for equality, justice, dignity, or a variety of progressive values, especially, asking them to account for their positions on Palestine as well. And the other thing is that there are other battlegrounds for Palestine. So at the legislative level, we have a Democratic Congress or Democratic House of Representatives, which has actually moved the needle somewhat on Palestinian rights with a letter against in favor of ending the Gaza blockade led by Mark Pocan in Wisconsin. We've seen, pro-boycott legislation from Ahmad, which allows for Palestinian civil society and their allies on especially U.S. campuses to advocate for Palestinian rights. And we really actually have seen from an executive level an attack on student organizing and critique of Israel through the executive order on anti-Semitism. So the battleground as well is for the discourse and to try to affirm what are longstanding principles and shared principles around freedom of expression and the right to boycott as a peaceful means of peaceful protest, which is a long American history, really. So those are a couple of areas, but there are certainly many others. I think one of the things that we've seen is really a scary prospect for Israel is the case in the International Criminal Court that basically calls out Israeli war crimes in Gaza in 2014, but also ongoing in Gaza and East Jerusalem and the West Bank. And there needs to be increased pressure to really hold Israel accountable when it comes to war crimes, because it matters for an international legal order. It matters for human rights writ large. And those are some of the areas where I think Palestinians have been effective in pushing the conversation and seeking accountability.
Thank you so much, Halah. So there's a related question to Zaha by Nadia. So she's asking, what should Palestinians and their allies do in the event of a Biden win, especially given all the threats to free speech and organizing for Palestinian rights that Halah alluded to? What do you think should Palestinians do, Halah, if Joe Biden wins? And I would just like to add another sub-question to this one. To what extent do you think can decisions taken by Trump be reversed by a new administration, whether it's Biden or someone else? Zaha?
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Let me take the what Trump can do, and I'll let Halah take the Biden question.
Okay.
So the reversal, what can be reversed among the panoply of sort of terrible actions that the Trump administration has taken? I mean, let's start with the big action that the Trump administration took, which was to release this peace plan that is basically a memorandum of understanding between Israel and the U.S. about how much territory the state of Israel can annex and how much of that the U.S. would recognize. So on that piece right there, and in general, the articulation of U.S. parameters can be disregarded by the next administration. So Biden could choose to, to disregard what Trump has laid out in the plan. But the reality of it is that Israel is taking action on the ground right now towards the implementation of that plan. We saw its recent announcement of E1 construction of settlements in the E1 area, and also in Givat Hamatos. Those two areas would close off the possibility of having a contiguous Palestinian state within the West Bank connected to Gaza. So Israel's already taking action to build settlements that would create irreversibility towards this Trump plan. And I have a hard time seeing a Biden administration taking meaningful action on Israeli settlements, because Biden, as vice president to Barack Obama, was the voice in President Obama's ears that really prevented, meaningful action from taking place within the Obama administration. So I don't have much hope. But theoretically, a new administration could disregard this Trump plan and could even unrecognize what the U.S. What a U.S. previous administration recognizes in terms of Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. On the issue of Jerusalem and the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, this is obviously a U.S. decision where to locate its embassy. It can decide in a new administration that it wants to move the embassy from Jerusalem back to Tel Aviv. The question is what president would have the political will to do that? Even among even among the progressive candidates, they haven't indicated definitively that they would take that action. Senator Sanders said he would consider it. Elizabeth Warren, in her last debate, seemed flustered and not realizing who was responsible for locating the embassy. She indicated that Palestinians and Israelis could decide that issue. I don't know if that was nerves during the debate or if she just didn't understand. But it would take a lot of political capital for a president to come back and say, we're moving the embassy back to Tel Aviv. So, but it's conceivable. That is something that could be reversed depending on the president. In terms of reopening sort of the PLO office that was closed in Washington, that would be very difficult because of congressional legislation that makes that difficult to do, but also because of the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act that was passed a while back, which was amended recently, which makes the presence of PLO officials or the opening of a PLO office in the U.S. Consent to jurisdiction for millions of dollars in lawsuits against the PLO for victims of the violence in Israel-Palestine during the Second Intifada. These are American citizens. So that is unlikely to happen, a reopening of the PLO office. Also, in terms of the consulate for Palestinian affairs in Jerusalem that was merged with the U.S. Embassy to Israel, that would be difficult to reopen again unless some creative way was found to go around congressional legislation that would prevent that. And then on terms of UNRWA aid, that could be redone. That could be engaged. But U.S. could be re-engaged with UNRWA and continue its contributions or recontinue the contributions. But in terms of reestablishing funding for the Palestinian Authority, that would be much more difficult because of the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, which would open up the PLO and the PA to lawsuits for terrorism claims.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Zaha. This is, I think, it's like it's you gave us a comprehensive account of about the difficulties to reverse Trump's decisions. So thank you. Halah, very quickly, do you have any more insights to add into what Palestinians and their allies can do if Joe Biden wins the elections?
Yes. So I would say one addition is that we really, when it comes to Biden, it's important to look at his evolution as well on racial justice and what has prompted that, and really how the grassroots movements have been effective in pushing Democratic candidates writ large, especially the establishment, including people like Biden. Biden historically had a major role in the war on crime legislation, which historically, effectively mass criminalized Black communities in America, and was extremely detrimental to policies of mass incarceration. And now we see Biden taking really the lead of, not taking the lead, but taking note of the grassroots push and push for accountability, to end private prisons, to end, to have fair sentencing laws, and things like that around a range of criminal justice reforms. Not as far left as Warren and Sanders on these issues, but you've seen him move. So when it comes to Palestine, as the grassroots has been more effective in drawing parallels, intersectional solidarity across, issues affecting issues of systemic oppression against Black communities in America, as well as other marginalized communities, immigrant communities, and otherwise, we see more room for the Democratic electorate to demand that the establishment move beyond the typical stances on Israel that have yet to hold it accountable for preventing the context for a Palestinian state, and have continued to enable Palestinian human rights violations, or rather human rights violations by Israel. So some of the effective means of that were, of course, joint actions to educate across campuses in the U.S. So that's why the executive order on anti-Semitism is so important to oppose. And that is something that Biden could reverse with the right, political pressure. But we've also seen the effectiveness of direct actions, the effectiveness of mass demonstrations that have built coalitions across a variety of different issue areas, such as with the, previously with the Women's March, but there are other examples as well. And even mass petitions and statements that are led by leaders of or major figures from allied movements. These are some of the ways that the public has been able to leverage the grassroots public opinion around Palestine to push the democratic establishment. And I think it can continue to be effective with a Biden administration.
Thank you so much, Halah. This is very insightful. Zaha, there's a question from Mahdi that you might be able to answer. So he's asking, what can we expect the outcome to be after the PA's rejection of the so-called deal of the century? And what type of pressure will the U.S. and Israel attempt to apply on Palestinians?
I don't think there was ever any doubt that the Palestinians were going to reject it. I think the plan was crafted in a way to ensure Palestinian rejection. I mean, you don't put together a plan where you remove every single final status issue from the negotiating table and then expect Palestinians to say, okay, we like this. There was never any doubt. So, I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot of consideration of Palestinians at all in any of this. And I think that they were very much expecting the rejection. But that doesn't mean that it's stopping anything. I mean, everything's proceeding as planned, and we can't expect the at least some movement toward annexation, we still have yet to see what kind of coalition government's going to be formed in Israel with the elections they had yesterday, but it looks like Netanyahu is on top, and even with a Gantz-led government, there's going to be a real push towards annexation before November, or at least before a change in the administration, if one takes place in January of 2021, so that the U.S. can recognize Israeli sovereignty. And this is important. The recognition of Israeli sovereignty is important to Israel because it muddies the waters in cases like the that are brought in the International Criminal Court. Because if Palestinians, Palestinians are arguing that the court has jurisdiction because the occupied territories and what's beyond the Green Line is part of the Palestinian state, which they have the ability to invite the ICC jurisdiction over, while Israel and the U.S. will argue that no, we recognize this area as Israeli, and so it just muddies the waters. And so that also is part of the reason why there's this interest in getting U.S. recognition for Israeli sovereignty over the areas that Israel wants to annex. What can Palestinians, or what are Palestinians going to do? I'm sorry, is that accurate, Nua, the question? Yeah. So I mean, Israel and the Palestinians are inseparable in terms of their economic relations and the reliance of the Palestinians on their movement and access to their natural resources, to their land, to go to their places of worship. It is difficult for Palestinians to take a posture of, we're not going to engage anymore with Israelis at all. I mean, we've seen Palestinians try to do that on the economic level. There was an effort to stop transfers of Palestinian patients to Israeli hospitals. There was an effort to stop purchasing Israeli cattle or sheep from Israel, and the response from Israel was swift in terms of shutting the borders, shutting Palestine's borders to all their ability to export. So the area within which Palestinians can maneuver is very, very limited because of just the amount of control that Israel has over their daily lives and the fact that they're so fragmented. Mm-hmm. The priority ought to be, in terms of getting the Palestinian house in order, in terms of working towards national reconciliation between Hamas in Gaza and the PA in Ramallah. Above all of that should be sort of reinvigorating the Palestine Liberation Organization so that it becomes more truly reflective of Palestinians everywhere, so that a national strategy can be articulated to address the threats that are now facing Palestinians. And I think that should be on the top of the Palestinians' priority right now. Without a national strategy, there's no way you're going to be able to mobilize your people around confronting the threats posed by Israel and posed by a very permissive U.S. government.
Thank you, Zaha. So we basically talked with Halah about what Palestinian solidarity groups can do from the U.S., and with Halah now we talked about what the Palestinian Authority and Palestinians can do from inside the OPT. There's a question that I would like to ask Halah, which is from John. So he's basically asking, has any candidate been questioned on supporting or opposing a single, fully democratic state with equal rights for all if the Palestinians were to make that their goal? Do you think, Halah, based on the work and the research you did on the commentary, has anyone asked a question about the one democratic state and whether they oppose it, support it?
I think the focus has been especially on really stipulating U.S. aid, making it conditional, stipulating what is your approach to the occupation. And in response to the deal of the century, you could have seen people say, no, we need to, if this is going to be the two-state solution, this is not a two-state solution. What you're creating is apartheid. And if that's the case, then if there's one government that has jurisdiction over everybody, then let's just make it equal rights for everybody. We see instead all of the candidates consistently reiterating this stance around the two-state solution. But I think what is very interesting to see is that if there's more of a focus on the occupation, ending the occupation, stipulating U.S. aid to, be conditional on not being applied to, things that violate human rights or international law, then you have room for people to advocate for a broader solution that says, look, the facts on the ground are that there's one entity that really has the power, and how can we instead focus on ensuring equal rights for all? And there has been there's definitely been vocal support for that among Palestinians, some Palestinian groups for a long time. Palestinians have had a consistent stance of demanding equality, and the two-state solution has really been this now really what seems like a language that's never been coupled with accountabilities, and it's led to this situation where we have a one-state situation in a way, and there's room to talk about how to make that accountable then to equal rights for all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Halah. Zaha, David is asking if you see a significant role that could be played by progressive U.S. Christian leaders. What do you think about this question, and what U.S. progressive Christian leaders can do in the U.S.?
Political movements in the U.S. over the course of U.S. history, it's always been, church groups and church leaders that have led that struggle, civil rights struggle and immigrant rights struggle. You always find leadership among progressive church groups and pastors. So and this has not been different in the case of Israel-Palestine. We have a history now of various churches struggling with Palestinians on the ground and bringing the Palestinian story home to their congregations and enriching the public discourse because of that. So absolutely, I think there's an important role to play there, and I think we also shouldn't underestimate, sort of even among evangelicals, what we understand from the younger evangelicals is that when given accurate information about what's going on, when they visited Israel, Palestine, and seeing for themselves, they are movable. They are movable towards supporting Palestinian human rights. And so this is a really important constituency within civil society that I think as the Trump plan gets implemented more and more, and as we start to see de jure annexation rather than simply de facto and U.S. recognition of that, these constituencies, especially within U.S. churches, will become even more important in the same way they were important during the anti-apartheid struggle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zaha. So we have more questions, actually 5 more questions, but we're running out of time. So unfortunately, I won't be able to ask the questions. And just for the audience to know, I was asking the questions with the highest number of votes. So it's not that I ignored you, but I just wanted to ask the questions that had more votes. So this has been actually very, very informative. Thank you so much, Zaha and Halah, for joining us. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about the long history of U.S. support to Israel. We talked about the shift in the policy discourse among Democratic candidates recently, and the rising sympathy for Palestinians among the Democratic electorate. We assessed the different stances on Palestine by Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders. We talked about the role of civil society in influencing the shift in the conversation on Palestine and Israel. And then we talked about different measures that could be taken in Palestine and in the U.S. to further shape the discourse on Palestine and what the U.S. A future U.S. administration can do, keeping in mind that it would be very challenging to reverse some of the decisions that the Trump administration took in the past 3 years. So thank you so much for joining us. If you like these policy labs, please don't forget to donate for Al-Shabaka, because it's only through your donations that we can keep on having these policy labs. Halah, thank you so much, and Zaha for participating in the policy lab. Have a wonderful evening or day, and I will see you next month, and we will hopefully cover another interesting topic. And it was Noor Arafi with you. I forgot to present myself at the beginning. Thank you. Bye.
Super Tuesday, people, vote.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you, everybody. Yes.
Bye.